The silence that changed everything. Crescent Hill High was always alive with energy, filled with the sound of students' voices and the slamming of lockers. But among all the noise, there was always one person who seemed almost invisible. Her name was Aria Valente. 13 years old, small for her age, and painfully shy, Aria often moved through the hallways like a shadow, seen but unnoticed. Her long black hair always covered half her face, shielding her dark brown eyes from anyone's gaze. She spoke to no one, sat alone at lunch. And while other students gossiped or laughed or fought for attention, Aria simply existed in silence. At Crescent Hill, that kind of silence was dangerous. This was not a school for the weak. Here, reputation and influence meant everything. If you didn't have a powerful group of friends backing you up, you were nothing more than prey. And to most people, that's exactly what Aria Valente was. But what no one knew was that she wasn't alone at all. Her father was Marco Valente, a man who owned the shadows of the city. A man whose name people whispered when they thought no one was listening. A man known as the king of the underworld. And when someone crossed Marco Valente, they didn't live to tell about it. The one who made that mistake was Caleb Bennett. Caleb was Crescent Hill's golden boy, the son of Owen Bennett, a real estate magnate who practically owned half the city. Caleb was rich, charming in that dangerous kind of way, and cruel beneath his polished exterior. Everyone knew Caleb ran Crescent Hill like his personal kingdom. If you were on his good side, life was easy. If you weren't, he made sure you paid. The moment Caleb noticed Aria, he knew she'd be an easy target. At first, it was just small things. A shove in the hallway, knocking her books from her hands, sneering when she bent down to pick them up. She never fought back, never cried, never ran to a teacher. And that intrigued him. Most kids showed fear. Most avoided his eyes and did whatever they could to stay out of his way. But not Aria. She looked at him directly, calm and quiet, as if she were watching a scene she had already seen before. And that made Caleb furious. So he escalated. The pushes became shoves hard enough to make her stumble. The whispered taunts turned venomous. He cornered her in the hallways, blocked her path, and said things loud enough for others to hear. "Still keeping your head down, Valente?" he'd murmur. "Scared? Or maybe you're just used to being invisible." And still, no reaction. No begging. No tears. Her silence was maddening. But Caleb had no idea who he was pushing. And one mistake would cost him everything. One Friday afternoon, in front of a crowded cafeteria, Caleb made his move. He walked right up to Aria's table as if the room was a stage, grabbed her lunch bag, and ripped it open. "Let me guess," he sneered, holding up her sandwich for everyone to see. "Peanut butter and jelly? That's pathetic." His friends erupted into laughter. Some students glanced over, some smirked, but no one intervened. No one ever did. "Is this all your family can afford?" Caleb continued, waving the sandwich like a trophy. "Or is your dad too busy doing something illegal to make you a decent lunch?" He dropped the sandwich on the floor, then deliberately stepped on it. Bread and peanut butter squished under his designer sneakers, staining the cafeteria's clean white tiles. Aria watched, her face expressionless. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't flinch. She picked up her bag and walked away as if nothing had happened. But Caleb had made a fatal error. Aria didn't forget, and neither did her father. Caleb had grown up thinking he was untouchable. His father's money and connections had always gotten him out of trouble. A suspended teacher? Transferred the next day. A student who complained? Their parents mysteriously lost their jobs. He was above consequences. Until now. Caleb thought bullying Aria was harmless fun. But he didn't know that her father, Marco Valente, ruled a world far darker than Owen Bennett's polished empire. And Marco had rules. No one touched his family. That night, at the Valente estate, Aria sat across from her father in silence. The marble floors gleamed under the chandelier's light. Marco sipped his whiskey slowly as he studied the photo Aria had placed before him. It was a picture Caleb had doctored. Aria's face warped into a grotesque smirk, red letters spelling out Psycho Valente across the top. Marco stared at it for a long moment. Then he set his glass down carefully and said in a voice cold enough to freeze blood, "Who did this?" Aria answered with no hesitation, "Caleb Bennett." Marco smiled, but it wasn't a smile anyone wanted to see. The next day, Caleb's world began to unravel. The photo disappeared from every social media platform within hours. His account gone. His friends' accounts disabled. Even private group chats were wiped clean. And then the messages started. "Delete everything, or I'll delete you." Caleb shrugged it off at first. But at midnight, the Bennett estate's secure landline rang. Only family used that number. Owen Bennett picked up, expecting a business associate. Instead, a voice spoke. Low, calm, deadly. Tell your son to behave. Before I teach him myself. There was no introduction. There was no need. Owen knew exactly who it was. Marco Valente. The next morning, Caleb was called into his father's office. What did you do to Marco Valente's daughter? Owen demanded, his face pale. Caleb's bravado cracked. I didn't. I just... Stop. Owen's voice was hollow. You don't understand who you crossed. But Caleb wasn't convinced. Not yet. He still thought his father could handle it. That this was just another mess to clean up. Until that night. It was after a party when Caleb was taken. A black Cadillac blocked his path in the parking lot. Two men in suits stepped out. Get in the car. Caleb laughed. You don't tell me what to do. But then the door opened. Marco Valente was inside. Caleb's mouth went dry. He got in. Inside the car, Marco sat still, his eyes sharp as knives. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. You humiliated my daughter, Marco said, flipping a small knife between his fingers. You thought there wouldn't be consequences? Caleb swallowed hard. I won't warn you again, Marco continued. You will stay away from her. You will never say her name. If I hear about you near her again, I'll make sure you disappear. And Caleb believed him. After that night, Caleb was never the same. He didn't return to Crescent Hill High. Rumors swirled. Some said he was sent to a school across the country. Others whispered he was too afraid to leave his house. The Bennett family sold their mansion within the month. And Aria? She walked the halls of Crescent Hill in silence, as always. But this time, no one laughed. No one whispered. They lowered their eyes and moved out of her way. Days passed. Then weeks. One day, Lena Doyle, Caleb's ex-girlfriend, and one of the girls who had laughed the loudest at Aria, approached her at lunch. She placed a tray down at Aria's table, sat, and said, I didn't mean for it to get that far. Aria didn't reply. She picked up her tray and walked away. Lena sat there, alone. For the first time, she understood what it felt like to be invisible. But Aria hadn't won because her father was Marco Valente. She had won because she endured. Because she never broke. Because she stood in silence and let the world destroy itself. That was real power. Her father asked her one morning over breakfast, What are you thinking about? She looked at him calmly. Whether you ever regretted anything. Marco smiled faintly. No, he said. Because everything I did made me who I am. Aria thought about that. And when she returned to school, she realized something. She didn't need to be feared. She didn't need revenge. She only needed to be herself. And that was enough to make everyone else afraid. The end.